faculty member of the Public and International Affairs Department and also the Center for Global Studies. I want to begin by thanking the various units within the university whose generous support has made this afternoon's talk possible. The Department of History and Art History, in particular, Professor Brian Platt, who worked so hard at relatively short notice to make all of this possible. The Ali Borodak Center for Islamic Studies, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and last but not least, the Office of the Provost here at George Mason University. From 9/11 to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, what used to be called the global war on terror, national security and civil rights, the religion of Islam, Muslims in general, these are all topics around which the national debate in recent years has been deeply polarized, shrill, and often frighteningly uninformed. Floating above all of this, however, as a consistent voice of reason and a judicious and remarkably informed commentary has been Reza Aslan, our speaker today. For many of you, he will need no introduction. You'll be familiar with him from his many appearances across an enormous variety of media, including multiple appearances on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, Rapport with Stephen Colbert, all major networks, a recent prominent debate on CNN hosted by Christian Amanpour. Reza Aslan is, in theory, an associate professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside, although the exhausting cross-continental itineraries he keeps makes me wonder if he actually spends any time whatsoever in Los Angeles. It's always Reza Aslan from Australia, Reza Aslan reporting from Israel, Reza Aslan from Amsterdam, sometimes simultaneously, and I never quite figured out. Outside the academy, Reza runs a small empire of media companies doing very innovative work, serves on the board of a number of prominent foundations and nonprofits dealing with international peace and security issues. And in addition to his academic work in comparative literature, and I should note that he has a new book published just this month, Tablet and Pen, an anthology of literature from the Middle East, wonderful Eid or Hanukkah or Christmas gift for getting your lists in order for those upcoming holidays. He's widely known for two landmark books. Initially, his international bestseller, No God But God, widely translated, named one of the 100 most important books of the last decade, and more recently, How to Win a Cosmic War, published later in paperback as Beyond Fundamentalism. Reza, of course, comes to us at a particularly opportune moment, given the sequence of events that have played out in this country over the last year. The fiasco around the Park 51 Center, the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, the ensuing debate about the threat of Quran burning, and more recently the controversy around comments made by ex-NPR correspondent Juan Williams on Fox News. Which began to make the debate on Islam and Muslims in the United States look remarkably like the direction that things have been taking in Europe in recent years. There's been a distinctly Islamophobic turn in the public debate. Here to help us what's been going on and to address this afternoon the question, is America Islamophobic? Please join me in welcoming to George Mason University, Dr. Reza Aslan.
Thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Peter. Peter knows this, but I think everyone else should know that he is like my academic and intellectual hero. Honestly, all I do is just steal stuff from him. It is a great pleasure to be here on the campus of George Mason. Thank you all for coming out here on this beautiful afternoon when you could just be outdoors enjoying the great fall. As Peter was mentioning, I'm kind of crisscrossing the country right now, touring for his collection, Tablet and Pen, which by the way does make a great gift. Not really a stocking stuffer per se, but so you'll have to excuse me if I'm just a little bit tired and I start not making sense, which happens quite often. I actually was waylaid on the way here in Oklahoma. I had gone there because I was looking forward to stoning people. Lo and behold, I show up and they're like, you can't do that anymore. Weird, right? Apparently they passed a law saying that I'm not allowed to stone people anymore. But no, in all honesty and in all seriousness, I'm very, very happy to hear that after 200 years in the Union, Oklahoma is now finally under the purview of the United States Constitution. Well done, Oklahoma. Well done. Well done. It's kind of funny, and we do laugh about it, but this sort of anti-Sharia hysteria that has kind of gripped most of this nation in the wake of the dying down of the Part 51 controversy. They need something to look at, so why not? You know, this whole Sharia hysteria is becoming quite a popular thing now. You hear this all the time. Of course, there was the famous remark by Sharon Engel when she was running for the Senate. And by the way, can we just take a moment and thank the state of Nevada for just one moment? Thank you, Nevada. Thank you. Sharon Engel, of course, you know, really surprised a lot of people by informing Americans that there are 2 cities in the United States living under Sharia. Did you know this? She mentioned Dearborn, Michigan, and Fairfield, Texas. Fascinating, fascinating. Of course, the mayor of Dearborn came out the next day and actually assured Ms. Engel that no, actually, the Constitution of the United States actually applies to Dearborn, Michigan. Thank you. The mayor of Fairfield, Texas said nothing because there's no such place in the world. Fairfield, Texas. I'm not kidding. Look it up. And then, of course, you had, you know, the king and queen of the anti-Muslim crazies, Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer, who's got some sort of weird obsession with me, won't stop emailing me. Get like 4 emails a day from this guy. You know, these 2, besides the fact that they are the founders of the very pivotal organization Stop Islamization of America. Did you know that? That the 1.5% of Muslims in this country are about to take over? You didn't realize that? Well, thank God for Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer, because they're making sure that it does not happen. Now, of course, Pamela Geller is you know, more famous. Before, she was famous for single-handedly coining the phrase, the mosque at ground zero. You know, that thing that's neither a mosque nor at ground zero. She was famous for blog posts stating that Barack Obama is the bastard love child of Malcolm X. I'm also not kidding about that. Robert Spencer, of course, before getting onto the whole anti-Sharia craze, he's been writing a lot of blogs about how America is about to succumb to Sharia. We're this close. The proof? Well, Elena Kagan, of course. Elena Kagan, her ascension to the Supreme Court is step 1 in the Muslim takeover of the United States. I don't know how he found that out. I thought we kept it quiet. I figured she's a Jew. No one will ever know. I figured it out. But apparently Robert Spencer figured it out. Now, Robert Spencer, of course, is the same person who quite famously said that Campbell Soup's decision to issue a line of halal soups to go along with its line of kosher soups is a, you know, the first step in the Muslim takeover. One can of soup at a time. Now, the truth is that we laugh at these people because they are clowns, and you should laugh at them. That's the only response to these clowns, is to laugh. But then, how do you explain Newt Gingrich? This is, you know, about as mainstream as it gets. This is the GOP presidential frontrunner. This might be the man who may be the next president of the United States. And yet Newt Gingrich has now come out and said that he wants a federal law passed banning Sharia in the United States, which is kind of like banning Americans from riding unicorns. But it gives you an indication of how mainstream these crazy issues when it comes to Islam is becoming. We all know that anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States is at unprecedented levels. The polls show that quite clearly. The Washington Post just released a poll that showed that 49% of Americans have a negative view towards Islam. Now that's a really, really high number, but what's really interesting about that poll, that it's a 9% jump from the exact same poll taken 2 months after September 11th. So in other words, not only is anti-Muslim sentiment at all-time highs in this country, it's higher now than it was in the immediate aftermath of those attacks. And, as I mentioned, it's becoming increasingly mainstream, so that these figures, these clowns who have always been with us, but who for the most part have been in the shadows and on the fringes, are now popping up on network television. They're popping up in the news. They are somehow being given the role of commentator about Islam, which is crazy. It's like, you know, having a discussion about race relations in America and inviting the Ku Klux Klan. Doesn't make any sense. And yet that's where we are today. The question is why? I mean, I think this is something that a lot of people are, like myself, are trying to grapple with. What has changed in this country that has gotten us to this point? It's a complicated question. I think there's a lot of things involved in it. Certainly the economy plays a role. There's no question about it. In times of economic distress, it's only natural for Americans to look to some kind of a scapegoat, somebody that they can sort of pour their fears and anxieties about the economy upon. And it seems as though the current scapegoat of choice, depending on where you live in this country, is either Mexicans or Muslims. So God save you if you happen to be a Mexican Muslim in the United States right now. My advice to you is to stay home. But it's not just that. I think you do have to bear in mind that there is a sense of war weariness that has descended on people. The kind of raw, patriotic sort of go military attitude that we had in 02, 03, 04 has begun to kind of fade away a little bit. We are involved in 2 major wars in the Middle East, though there's no reason why you should know that if you actually watch the news. I mean, we just had an election, a very important election with global consequences. Did you hear anyone bring up the fact that we're in 2 wars? Of course not. Nobody seems to care. But it's still going on. Even though the president has told us that one of those wars is now over. Oh, good. I think a lot of Americans kind of want to know what actually happened. What did we actually get for the trillions of dollars and the hundreds of thousands of deaths out of that war that now it's over? I feel that. I understand that. I make a significant portion of my livelihood from talking about these wars, and I am weary of them. I get that. I think part of it has to do with sort of this fear of homegrown terrorism, which we've been worried about for 10 years and which really hasn't reared its head until quite recently. I think what's really significant, and nobody in the FBI, nobody in the intelligence community would say that there's some kind of trend of radicalization of American Muslims. On the contrary, I think if there's a trend, the trend is that in 10 years of war, we've had 2, 3 instances of homegrown terrorism. That's remarkable. That's the news story right there. But all of these things, I think, have created the ground, the sort of the foundation, the soil for a lot of the anti-Muslim sentiments that we are seeing. But there is one thing that's not talked about enough, which I think is far, far more significant and goes far more towards explaining what's going on in this country than either the economy or anything else. And that is the man in the White House. The same poll that showed that almost 50% of Americans have a negative view towards Islam showed that 20% of Americans, 1 in 5, believe that the president is himself a Muslim. That's a 8-point jump from the exact same poll taken a year ago. More people believe that Barack Obama is a Muslim today than they did a year ago. Indeed, amongst Republicans, that number is 37%. Almost 40% of Republicans believe that Barack Obama is a Muslim. The good people at the Pew Forum began to crunch these numbers, and what they discovered was absolutely fascinating. What they discovered was that the more you disagree with President Obama's domestic policy, the more likely you are to think he's a Muslim. Don't like the health care bill? It's because he's a Muslim. Don't like the financial regulation bill? It's probably because he's a Muslim. In other words, Islam in this country is becoming otherized. It's becoming a receptacle into which Americans are throwing their fears and anxieties about the economic situation, their anxieties about political instability, the fears that they have about the changing racial landscape of this country, the change in guard in the political establishment. More importantly, the role of the United States in the global stage. You see, we're in the midst of an identity crisis in this country. An identity crisis that I myself thought I would never actually experience. Indeed, Peter mentioned what's going on in Europe, where, entire political parties, the British National Party, the Freedom Party of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, the Northern League in Italy. Entire political parties are being formed whose sole platform is let's get rid of the Muslims. And yet they're actually winning elections. In the case of Geert Wilders, the same man who wants to make it a punishable crime. He wants to send you to prison if you are caught with the Quran in the Netherlands. The same man who wants to tax women for the right to wear a headscarf. That guy is now essentially the kingmaker in the Dutch parliament. That kind of stuff we thought could never happen in America. No way. Not in the United States. Laws targeting Muslim communities, taking away the same rights and privileges that Muslims, that every other religious community in Europe enjoys, taking those rights and privileges away from Muslims. Not here. That's a European thing. That's what the French do. We don't do that kind of stuff. We can't imagine something like that happening. The notion that you get throughout Europe, where the very concept of identity, whether it's French identity, or British, or Dutch, or German, or Italian identity, that sense of national identity that has been, well, muted, I suppose, is one way of saying it, ever since the Second World War, and which is now resurging throughout Europe and defining itself directly in opposition to its Muslims. That could never happen here in the United States. And yet all of those things are happening. And it's because the United States, strangely, weirdly, in a way that I think most people could have never imagined happening, is undergoing the exact same identity crisis that we've seen over the last 2 decades in Europe. I don't think Americans are all that sure what it means to be American anymore. I don't think they know what America means anymore, because what we thought America was, and certainly what it was in the 80s and 90s, doesn't exist any longer. We are not the global superpower that we thought we were. We're certainly not the economic superpower that we thought we were. We may still be the military superpower, but we're now dealing with a multipolar world unlike anything that we have experienced in modern memory. And I think the America that a lot of Americans thought existed, or felt, or wanted to think existed, people are starting to wake up and realize that that America doesn't exist any longer. Hence the crazed hysteria on the right in this country every time Barack Obama goes to a foreign country and actually acknowledges the reality of a globalized world, actually recognizes, well, we kind of need Indonesia's help. We sort of need trade with China. We're kind of reliant on India. Certain political circles in this country go bananas when they hear this, because what they want is a president who lives in some sort of imaginary dream world, who shows up and says, this is how things are going to be, as though that world in which we are the sole polar, the sole power in the world actually exists any longer, and it doesn't. And that's caused a severe crisis of identity in this country. And, just as we learned in Europe, in times of crisis, in times when identity is in flux, the easiest way to fashion an identity, to form a strong sense of self, is in opposition to another. Find someone who sticks out within your community, within your state, within your country, and identify yourself in opposition to that person. What does it mean to be American for a vast swath of this country? It means not being Muslim. That's what it means. That's what it means. Hence, these statements that you get over and over again, and which you heard a lot during the Part 51 controversy, right? They attacked us on September 11th, and now they want to build a mosque at Ground Zero. Excuse me? Did you catch that? That's standard fare now. And so, the issue here is one of identity. Now, to be honest, this is nothing new. Certainly not unprecedented in American history. We're actually quite good at finding somebody within our midst to identify ourselves in opposition to. And indeed, everything, every word that is being said about Muslims in the United States has been said about Mormons, Quakers, Jews, Catholics. In fact, in the 19th century, we actually had a political party in this country, the Know-Nothings. You American history buffs ought to remember those guys. They actually wanted to be called the Know-Nothings. Apparently, it was a different time. Or was it? The Know-Nothings, right? These were the political group that wanted to curb Catholic immigration into this country. Catholics couldn't possibly be Americans. How can they be both loyal to the United States and to Rome at the same time? They don't look like us. They don't pray like we do. They don't worship like we do. They're different. They're foreign. They're exotic. They're not American. They don't belong here. We passed laws in this country stripping Catholics of their human rights. Now, of course, we look back on that time. We look back on the Know-Nothings with derision, with shame, and with a healthy dose of mockery, because you should laugh at these people. They're funny. The exact same thing was said about Jews in this country in the early part of the 20th century, particularly in the 1920s, after the massive influx of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. You had politicians like Louis McFadden in FDR's administration talking about the Jewish conspiracy to take over the country. You had business leaders like Henry Ford publishing the most despicable, most racist, anti-Semitic rants, and actually selling quite well. Selling them out sometimes, his pamphlets. You had religious leaders like Father Tom Coughlin, who would talk about the Jews as Christ killers, who had no business in the United States, who weren't like us, who didn't worship like us, who didn't pray like us, who don't look like us, who can't possibly be Americans. They can't be trusted. They're not a part of the religious fabric of this country. In 1924, we passed a law in this country to curtail Jewish immigration because we didn't want them here. Now, again, we look back at that time. We look back at those people with shame, with derision, and with mockery. I'm absolutely convinced. I have total confidence in this country. I know for a fact that in a generation or two from now, we will look back at the Robert Spencers and the Pamela Gellers and the Newt Gingriches and the Reverend Franklin Grahams and the Sharon Engels with the same shame, with the same derision, and with the same mockery that we look back on these other anti-Semites and anti-Catholic Americans. They are on the wrong side of history. Their ideas, their thoughts are going to be swept away into the garbage bin of history. That's a fact. That's inevitable. There's nothing they can do about it. The question is how do we get there? And we know we're going to get there. We know that's going to happen. The issue is how do we get there? And of course, we are somewhat complicated by the fact that there is something else involved in this, which is that, again, we are, believe it or not, engaged in 2 wars in Muslim-majority countries. And this sort of larger ideological conflict that we used to call the war on terror, the war of ideas. So there is a real national security issue involved here. In fact, this isn't my opinion. I'm not the one who's saying that there's actually a national security consequence to the way in which our rhetoric about Islam and about Muslims in this country has become increasingly mainstream. That's the former National Security Advisor, Jim Jones's opinion. That's the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen's opinion. That's the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates's opinion. That's the opinion of our commander of the troops in Afghanistan, David Petraeus. They are the ones who are telling us that there is a price to pay for this kind of rhetoric. It's not my opinion, it's theirs. And that's an important reality. And there is a price to be paid in this larger war of ideas. The subtitle of my second book, How to Win a Cosmic War, was The End of the War on Terror. Now at the time, what I meant was that, new administration, new way of thinking about terrorism, not in terms of as a war, but as what it's supposed to be, which is a criminal enterprise. But what I've come to realize recently is that the war on terror is over, but it's over in a different way than I actually thought it was. In other words, the very concept of the war on terror, whose philosophical foundations were my ideas are better than your ideas, is over. Again, when you have one of the leading Republicans, one of the stalwarts of the so-called war on terror, say, and I'm talking about Newt Gingrich again, not that I mean to pick on him. Well, yeah, actually, I do mean to pick on him because he's a moron. When he says, well, we'll let them build a mosque at ground zero when they let us build a church in Mecca, you've given up. Because that's not how we actually define our values. That's not the point of the war of ideas, is it? That we define our ideas and our values by what the Saudis do? Here's an idea. How about we let our women vote when the Saudis let their women vote? Okay? Good? Mr. Gingrich? We've given up. We have absolutely given up. But that doesn't make the threat any less real. We are under threat. We do have a very serious national security problem with radicals throughout the region. And if you believe the people who are actually in charge of that conflict, we're making it worse with our words and with the way that we are conducting ourselves in this country. But the truth is that I don't care about that. I'm kind of with Jon Stewart on this one, right? Who very famously said, who gives a bleep what they think about us? He's got a point. I mean, it's not like there's anything that we can do that's going to sort of, change bin Laden's mind. You might elect a Muslim for president again. And it's not like bin Laden's going to pick up his Kalashnikov and go home. Oh, I guess I was wrong about America. Never mind. No. This isn't about how they think about us. This is about us. This is about who we are. This is about the country that we live in. You know, I came to this country from a country that doesn't have any religious freedoms. I came to this country old enough to know exactly what was going on. I became a citizen of the United States when I was 23 years old, so I knew perfectly well what I was promising this country, and I knew damn well what this country was promising me. And in a sense, what I'm worried about, again, is not what this means, what the sort of rampant Islamophobia that has gripped this country actually means to our security interests. That's important. That's important. But it's not as important as what it means to who we are and the nation that we are creating here. What kind of America do we want to be? What kind of America do we want to have? Now, I want to live in a country in which the religious fabric of this, the most religiously diverse nation in the world, that the racial fabric of this country that demographers tell us in a decade or two will become the first nation in history to be majority minorities. Think about that for a minute, because it is astounding. It's astounding. That's the country I want to celebrate. I don't really care if it scares people. I don't really care if it makes people worried that the America that they thought they knew is not the America that is the real, that is the reality. But I don't care about that. It doesn't bother me. Because this country has always had those people, and they've always lost. And they'll lose again. But it's going to take some effort. How do we get there? So, I think that education plays some role. I'm contractually obligated as an educator to say that. Education is important. Knowledge is important. Information is important. You need knowledge, you need education to be able to, at the very least, answer some of the more ridiculous statements that are out there. When Bill O'Reilly says, you know, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims, you need a little bit of education to say, that's really fascinating. I wonder how the victims of the Catholic IRA would say to that. I wonder what the victims of the Jewish terrorists of the Koch and Kahane movements, those within the Gush Emunim and the price tag movement, that the Israeli government calls Jewish terrorists, would say about that. I wonder what those radicals in Ayodhya, the Hindu terrorists who massacred dozens and dozens of Muslims in the name of Hindu nationalism, would say about that. I wonder what the victims of the Tamil Tigers would say about that, the Marxist/Hindu terrorists of the Tamil Tigers. I wonder what the victims of the Shinto terrorists of Aum Shinrikyo would have to say about that stupid statement. You need a little bit of education to be able to respond to that kind of idiocy. That's true. But let's be honest. Information doesn't change people's minds. Data does not reframe perceptions. You honestly believe that if I had 30 minutes alone with Bill O'Reilly, he'd come out and go, well, I guess I was wrong about Islam. Man, Muslims are great. Mine is sick. Of course not. This isn't about rational knowledge. There is no reason involved in this. It's something far more visceral. It's in here. And the way you change this is not through information. It's not even through education. Although education does play a role. I'm not saying it's irrelevant. The way you change this is through relationships. It's funny, that same poll that I started this talk on, the Washington Post poll that showed that almost 50% of Americans have a negative view towards Islam, also showed that 60% of Americans claim to have never met a Muslim. Which I personally find hard to believe. I mean, have you ever been to a doctor? Pretty good chance he's a Muslim. I think honestly they just assume that all Muslims wear turbans or something. I don't really know what that's about. But again, thank you to the Pew Forum. Because when they started crunching these numbers and breaking it down, what they discovered was that the greatest determinant to your views about Islam is whether you know a single Muslim. If you know one Muslim, and I don't mean like your best friend is a Muslim, I mean like the grocer is a Muslim, your neighbor is a Muslim, your dentist is a Muslim. If you know one Muslim, it cuts in half your negative view towards Islam. It goes from 50% to 25%. And I think that's pretty obvious why that's the case, isn't it? Because if you can break down these sort of barriers, these walls that separate us into different cultures, different ethnicities, different religions, different races, whatever, if you can break through that and recognize that actually we're all kind of dealing with the exact same problems and the same issues. We're all trying to figure out a way to overcome this economy. We're all dealing with the political instability of the last couple of years. We're all trying to figure out how to pay our mortgages. We're all trying to figure out how to get our kids to college, etc., etc. Then you start to realize that actually that otherness, that foreignness, that you thought Islam represented or Muslims represented, is just a mirage. It's about encounters. It's about relationships. Now, I'm not suggesting that every Muslim in this country should go door to door and introduce themselves. But that's actually a good way to get shot. Don't do that in Oklahoma. But what I am saying is that it is up to us. It is up to the individuals in this room. It's up to every Muslim in this country to be, no matter how unjust and how unfair this statement is, the representative of the 1.5 billion people on this earth who call themselves Muslim. Is that right? No, of course not. Is that fair? Absolutely not. Why the hell should you be responsible for that? There's no reason for it. Except that it's the fact. Except that it's the reality. Except that every one of us, unfortunately, has to represent this global, eclectic, and diverse faith. It means that every one of us in this room that's not a Muslim, but actually has a different vision of what America is, a vision that's much more grounded in the Constitution and in the values that define us as a nation, also has a responsibility to not put up with the BS that one hears on a nightly basis on Fox News and etc. That you yourself are also representatives, not just of Islam, not of Islam, but of America. The America that you envision, the America that you want to live in. All of us are responsible for that. So, we know where we're going to end. We know without question, without any kind of uncertainty, where we are going to end, because we've seen it over and over again in this country. But we know it's going to be a long ways to get there, and we know, like it or not, we're the ones responsible for getting us there. So, I guess if I'm going to leave you with anything at all today, it's this question. What does it mean to be American? And what does America mean? When you figure out how to answer that question, then I think the rest of it is going to be easy. Thank you very much.